section, we have 6 amazing storytellers who will tell their stories about how COVID has changed their lives. We will invite each storyteller up and we'll provide an introduction at that time. So, to start us off tonight is Stacy Rice. Stacy Rice is a speaker, educator, and consultant, and a community leader on transgender issues. She was recognized in 2016 as a Queer Hero Northwest by the Gay and Lesbian Archives of the Pacific Northwest, and is the former executive co-director of Q Center, the largest LGBTQ+ community center in the Pacific Northwest. She will be reading A Million Miles from Here. Stacy,
Thank you, Paige, for that lovely introduction. There are things you take for granted when living in the Pacific Northwest. You can bet that when November rolls around, the daily misting rain will start and not end until April, if you're lucky. And when you round a corner in Portland, Oregon, you would get a glimpse of Mount Hood staring back at you in all its snow-covered, iconic mountain glory. That's when I gasp and utter, "Holy crap," for the umpteenth time. I just can't believe that big mountain is right there. It was a little over 11 years ago when I first laid eyes on Portland in the Pacific Northwest. I stood on the busy curb of the airport waiting for my friends to pick me up. I watched the airport traffic swirl in front of me, and I stood aside as the people rushed by. I found myself being lifted up into a faraway, quiet space. The soft air surrounding me had a familiarity which passed straight through my heart. It was a feeling of something long forgotten. I wondered if perhaps in a previous life, I had breathed that same soft air now filling my lungs. I slipped into the back seat of my friend's car. We made our way through the busy city streets, dodging a light rail train or two. We drove past deep green conifer trees growing bigger than any I'd ever seen before. As I gazed up at the overcast skies slowly gliding by my window, all I could think was, I have been here. That feeling washing over me was deeper than my soul could wrap itself around. I felt I had finally come back home. During the week I spent visiting with my dear friends, I realized that I didn't want to go back to the life I had built for my transgender self back in North Carolina. When I thought about my life there, I felt tired, so tired. I was tired of fighting the daily struggle to keep myself out of harm's way. Living in a region of the country which can be unaccepting of people who are different is exhausting. I was tired of being closeted in my work life. I was not out to the people who lived in my condominium complex or to any of my acquaintances. I was never sure just how accepting they would be of me. I could see living my life here in Portland as being so much easier. Almost every person I met during that week asked me, "You are moving here, aren't you?" And during the first days of my stay, I would tentatively say, "Well, maybe." But by the end, I knew I wanted to move here. So 6 months later, I did. It was a couple of months before my moving day, and I started thinking about the long drive to Portland. How was I going to do it by myself? I thought of my friend Frankie and wondered if she would consider making the journey with me. I called and asked if she would come with me for support by helping with driving and just being a good travel buddy. I was delighted when she said yes. A few days later, she called back and shouted, "Stacy, Portland is on the other side of the country." My dear Frankie had looked at the map before she agreed to come with me. She was in a state of disbelief of how far away Oregon was. After some persuasion on my part, and after her initial shock wore off, she agreed, "Okay, I'll come with you." So on an early frost-filled morning in late February, I picked up Frankie and we eased ourselves on the Interstate 40 West. I was heading out of the Blue Ridge Mountains, which had held me close for most of my life. But I knew deep in my heart, I was heading towards a life that was going to be better. The drive across the country with Frankie was full of the most wonderful adventures. Ever so often, we would look at each other and just laugh. This trip was just like the movie Thelma and Louise. We had the sunglasses, but we veered off script. We didn't commit any murders or robberies along the way. In Tennessee, we found ourselves at Sun Studios in Memphis. We walked through the front door and into a room which held more hillbilly dust than you can ever imagine. We stood in the very spot of that worn linoleum tile floor where Elvis had sung all his early songs. We sped 85 miles per hour across the pancake flat panhandle of Texas. There we stopped at a combination gas station Subway restaurant in the absolute middle of nowhere. Then we saw two cowboys ride up on their horses in the pasture next to the Subway. They tied their horses to the fence and went in to order a sandwich. "Howdy, ma'am," they both said to Frankie and I as they walked by. In New Mexico, we left the interstate and drove onto Route 66. The old road took us past house after house with red chili ristros hanging like tasty stalactites, just waiting to be dropped into a red chili sauce. Then Frankie spotted a small apartment building and swung around in her seat. Looking intently into my eyes, she says, "If I ever disappear from my life and you wonder where I am, this is the first place you should look." After 6.5 long days of driving, we arrived. At the intersection of Interstate 84 and Interstate 5, the city of Portland was laid out before us. I stole a glance at the trip odometer, and it showed me we had driven 3,004 miles from my North Carolina front door. Little did I know on that day in early spring of 2012, those 3,004 miles would feel like a million miles in 2020. It was a few months into the pandemic when I realized there was something very precious I had taken. Something more than the never-ending rain and majestic Mount Hood that had become part of my life here. It was an unacknowledged realization that I would always be able to see my family back in North Carolina whenever I wanted. My daughter and her family live in central North Carolina, between the mountains to the west and the coastal plain to the east. It gets hot as blue blazes there in the summertime. There is a smothering humidity that drapes your body just like a wet blanket. Those mountains to the west held my 89-year-old dad, my brother and his family, all nestled in those tall, rounded, ancient blue mountains that fill up that part of the world. Just like clockwork every year, I would fly back a couple of times to visit them for a week or so. Then COVID made itself known. In June 2020, I lost my job and found myself quarantined and socially isolated. There was no workplace to connect to, no partner to be with, and no friends to visit, because they were as tightly quarantined as I was. As I sat on my sofa early one morning in June, it hit me. I was thinking about my family and how far away they were at that moment. I realized there was no way I could go see them because of the epidemic, and I started to cry. Deep, deep sobs. "I am so alone," is all I could say to myself over and over and over through my tears. A deep, soul-crushing loneliness and isolation overwhelmed me. I wasn't sure I could get over it. Loneliness and I have been friends for a pretty long time. We first got to know each other when I was around 5 years old. It was then I understood the world around me saw a little boy and not the little girl I knew I was inside. My days for a very long time were filled with a crippling anxiety and an aloneness that often overwhelmed me. All I could think was, I must be the only one in the world that feels this way. The loneliness and anxiety I experienced during those decades before my transition, 20 years before, Came back with a vengeance on that day to meet June. How in the world could I be at this place once again? My mind started racing. What if I get sick with COVID? What if I die alone? Whenever I felt a slight scratch in my throat or I had to cough, I panicked. I was sure this was the beginning of COVID. Do I have a fever? Good Lord, I don't even have a thermometer. What about my family? Are they safe? Despite all of these fears, I started to hatch a plan to go back to my family, even if just for a little while. There was no way I was going to get on a plane with my risk factors. I had had a heart attack and heart bypass surgery 5 years before. After all that damage, I didn't have a whole heart left for the attack anymore. However, I did fantasize about going through TSA with my carry-on. Once on the other side, I saw myself opening it up and pulling out a hazmat suit and respirator, which I would put on. That would protect me. However, I wasn't sure what the airline would think about a passenger traveling in a hazmat suit. I pictured my fellow travelers befuddled and all jealous they hadn't thought of my brilliant idea first. Would I even be able to go through TSA pre-check if I did this? Excuse me. Every day my life began to resemble a movie, this time planes, trains, and automobiles. I studied train schedules and researched quarantining options of a sleeper accommodation. The more I searched for answers, the more questions I had. What does an RV cost to rent? Can I camp out of the back of one? What about a rental car? How many days would it take me to get back closer to my loved ones? I continued to pore over my maps. It took a while before I realized that none of this was going to work. The strength of the pandemic restrictions, the amount of money and length of time needed to make this trip was just going to be too much. However, something larger than the pandemic and my fear of pandemic flying finally took me back home to my life. It was a phone call. My dad called the previous fall and told me he was tired. He was tired of living and struggling with a myriad of long-term health issues. He was tired of the social isolation he had been living with since the pandemic started. He said, I just want to go see your mom. It's been so long. My mom had passed away many, many years ago. I understood in my heart what he was saying. He was truly ready to go. A couple of months later, he passed on. I found myself heading back home to those North Carolina mountains that I love. Pandemic flying me down. I was on my way to say goodbye to the man whom I love so much. It was my dad who had, against so many odds, accepted his transgender daughter. I thought about the day so long ago when I first shared with my dad I was transgender, and I was going to eventually transition to my female self. The first words out of his mouth were, I really wish you wouldn't do this. Then he asked, isn't there a pill you can take for this? I remember being a bit amused by his question about a pill. I answered him, yes, there is, Dad. It's called estrogen. He struggled with what I was doing and becoming. It took some time for us to work through it all. He was a man born in the early 1930s, and he lived his whole life in those mountains, steeped in a very conservative culture. But he hung in there because of the love that he had for his daughter. Despite the fears he had, his thoughts about what people would say, and all the things he didn't understand, in the end, it was his unconditional love for me which overcame it all. This was the most beautiful gift he could have ever given me. Little did I know when I arrived back home for his funeral that his gift of acceptance would continue after his death. From my socially isolated pandemic home in Portland, I was suddenly thrust into spaces filled with people. So many people. People who had known me long before my transition over 20 years ago. Most had not laid eyes on me since then. They included my many cousins and other relatives. they were also longtime friends of the family, like the woman who cut my hair when I was a teenager, and people I went to high school with. And the plumber who plumbed the houses I built back in my previous male life, along with so many others. My mind was reeling with expectations, but I was also cautiously on guard. I could not help but wonder, what are people's reactions going to be? What will I have to deal with? When and where will I have to stand up for myself? But like the beautiful gift of love and acceptance that my dad had given to me, I was soon surrounded by that same love and acceptance from everyone I met over those next few days. Their words of how happy they were to see me after all these years were a balm to my soul. And I could just picture my dad smiling because he had set the best example of it.
Thank you, Stacy. Up next, we have Paul Iarrobino, who has lived in Portland, Oregon for over 30 years. He enjoys performing, producing shows, creating documentaries, teaching, and coaching. Paul has appeared in numerous national storytelling productions. He will be reading his piece, Metamorphosis.
Living through the pandemic has been a roller coaster ride for me. The extreme highs and lows have forced me to make changes I never imagined. My relationship with COVID got off to a rocky start. I was one of the first among my friends to get COVID in March of 2020. My early encounter with COVID reminded me of the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. COVID brought with it a new type of loss, panic and uncertainty that I never imagined before. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, each day, every day, sometimes all 4 emotions in one day. Was there acceptance for me? Absolutely not. While in bed scanning my emails, canceled events and volunteer commitments came in one by one. While my hubby remained, was flawless in how we transitioned his work from home, my schedule was completely gutted. Along with all of my self-employment income stream, I felt increasingly rudderless. As I gained strength, I wanted to face the world again, but how? As an extrovert, I missed being with people. That clearly was not an option with COVID. Reality was setting in. There was no more validation from my work and volunteering in the community. I was no longer needed as a volunteer driver to take older people to the senior center, because there was no senior center to take them to. They were closed. I felt a big void. I knew if I was struggling, then there were these seniors who were also experiencing what I was experiencing. After all, gathering at the center was a major activity in their lives. A few days later, I invested in a Zoom account. I had very little experience with Zoom prior to that, but I thought this might pull me out of my slump. I reached out to the local senior service director and pitched my idea. My thought was a virtual call could help them with this new forced isolation. The director liked the idea, and I signed up for a Zoom account that same day. I offered my first Zoom call to a handful of seniors on April 7th, 2020. We stumbled through the technology glitches together. I don't know how to mute. Can you hear me now? How do I turn my camera on? Our first Zoom meeting was very awkward, but the need to meet resonated. Someone asked if we could meet again, and that was the beginning of our Tuesday meetings. We still meet every Tuesday. I decided to frame the meeting around examining COVID through a lens of gratitude, resilience, and connection. There was so much angst initially. This direction helped the group focus and realize that the pandemic did not come with a user manual. We needed to support each other and be as flexible as possible. I found that limiting the group to about 8 people worked well for the 1-hour time block. And when that group filled, I started a second group, then a third, then a fourth. The overwhelming community need for these remote connections was beyond my bandwidth, but I felt satisfied creating and facilitating these weekly connections. Being surrounded by so many people, I became fascinated with how they were spending their extra time isolating at home. People were discovering new hobbies or nurturing dormant ones. I became a sponge soaking up all of these ideas. New recipes were popular, and I made my first loaf of bread in my adult life. It was really easy to make. A small number of ingredients, a Dutch oven, wax paper, and voila. While in the midst of making this new creation, memories of rolling dough with my mother as a young boy came back. The simple task of baking bread brought me back to the special memories of just the two of us in the kitchen while my older siblings were at school. I felt my mother with me as I kneaded the dough, just like she was with me more than half a century ago. I discovered my COVID convalescent plasma could help people who were sick, and I started donating. I learned that my first donation helped COVID patients in a North Las Vegas hospital, and that was all the reinforcement I needed. I donated a few times until the American Red Cross informed me that I didn't have enough COVID antibodies anymore to be helpful. Then I resumed donating blood as regular donations were down. My introduction to Ancestry.com started when my friend Jim half-kiddingly challenged us to submit our DNA to see if we were related. This back and forth between us went on for months, and it wasn't until the holiday season of 2021 that we did anything about it. You see, Jim's mother was Italian, just like my mother, and they were both really sassy. And Jim joked that over the years that we might have been distant cousins because our ancestors were all from the Aravino region of southern Italy. So here we were, me living in Portland, Oregon, Jim living in Bellingham, Washington, dripping our saliva into plastic tubes and sending our sputum off to in a prepackaged, secure envelope to a large DNA processing center. Yeah. And I always do this. Oh my goodness, I hope I can pause this. Okay, so this should be the, I don't want to number the pages next time. We sent off our samples and eagerly waited about 5 weeks for our results to arrive. Thanks to Jim's bargaining skills, we received a free 90-day subscription to Ancestry.com with our DNA search. I immediately dove into exploring my family tree. While I played with Ancestry.com in the past with a free 7-day subscription, I quickly discovered the website had changed with the times. It was a gold mine of ancestry connections with useful tools. With a multitude of DNA samples being processed during COVID, there was even more scientific evidence linking long-lost relatives to solving family tree puzzles. My father's maternal and paternal side were each easy to trace. In fact, I was able to track both sides of his family to the town of Torre-Nochel in the province of Avellino, back to the 1500s. I started making frequent internet searches to learn more about my ancestral birthplace. I quickly learned the town's meaning when translating Torre-Nochel. First, Torre refers to the large tower that early inhabitants built, and Nochel is derived from the Latin word Nocella, which translates to nuts. Locally, the translation refers to walnuts and hazelnuts, as they are plentiful there. This immediately started making sense to me because as a kid, I remember my dad telling us the translation for our ancestral town was land of the nuts. In less than a week, I traced my father's family back 11 generations by not letting one hint go unnoticed. I felt proud as I learned more about my roots and about the medieval town with narrow streets, porches, stone arches, and beautiful portals. Next, I printed off family profiles photos and historical documents and dropped the package in the mail to my 91-year-old father, who lives 3,000 miles away. I knew he would appreciate the historical research, but something unexpected was about to take place. My ancestral gods had a plan of their own. Despite being from a large family, we're not particularly close, and my relationship with my father and my siblings has been strained for most of my life. It was difficult to pinpoint the reasons for our family estrangement. It's been especially challenging for me navigating a relationship with my dad for the past several years because of fundamental differences in our social and political ideologies. We see the world very differently. Our contact has always been minimal. We exchange gifts a few times a year, but only as a formality and nothing more. Much to my surprise, something changed about a week after my father received the family history packet. Our first call lasted about an hour and a half, not the usual awkward 3 or 4 minutes. It was as if we both subconsciously knew if we followed this new ancestral script and dropped the triggering digs, we could forge a new relationship in life. During the first call, my father filled in some important blanks for me. He supplied me with information about family members who were missing from my newly harvested family tree. I took copious notes as he spoke, and I would go back and research these new clues. My father was pleased with how far my online research had taken me. I kept telling him it really wasn't that difficult, since many people have been paving the way before me. As a son, though, I valued and appreciated these new personal dynamics between us. My father began telling me stories connected to our ancestral birthplace. I learned about a great uncle who was a high-level military commander who had been responsible for airlifting the life-saving polio vaccination to the children of Torre-Luchel. My dad told me the townspeople were so grateful they erected a statue of him in the center of town as a tribute. Subsequent calls were filled with family stories I never heard before, or I was too young to remember. My dad became really animated as he made these family members come alive for me. Our conversation sparked a part of him that was dormant for decades, a part of him that craved reactivation. He became more gregarious and funny. He became the father I haven't experienced in several decades. It wasn't long before my father took me under his wing and directed me to family members all over the world. And to help fill in the blanks, there were relatives from the US and abroad I never knew existed. They included a 90-year-old great uncle who was a retired monk living in California, and a cousin from Torre-Luchel who now lives in Switzerland. That cousin only speaks Italian, but thanks to Google Translate, a whole new relationship is developing as we learn about each other. More recently, I connected with a second cousin who is an artist living in Santa Fe. I'll be traveling to New Mexico for business in a few months, and my husband Arnell and I will have a chance to meet him in person for the first time. Through our email exchange, we have shared a lot of our family history that I never knew. As mask mandates lift and scientific advances are made, I have a strong desire to take an ancestral journey to Torre-Luchel. I want to experience this ancient village full of my family's history for myself. Despite the havoc the pandemic unleashed, it also brought new possibilities. Yes, I got a rough start with COVID, but as I leaned into the extra time isolating at home, it's provided me with an open heart for new discoveries. The best one has been the new relationship I began with my father, and it continues today. This life-changing experience is something I never imagined possible before COVID. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Our next storyteller is Cher Coleman, who is a lifelong working, exhibiting, and teaching artist. She has been an oral storyteller in the schools, a writer/presenter of historical characters with Aspen Historical Society, and a TEDx presenter. She will be reading Love in the Time of COVID.
Thank you, Paige. And this is a poem. Love in the time of COVID. A journey of loving, longing, returning often to my own heart's carriage room, where I search to find a time travel vehicle with a full tank for a journey sometimes half a world away. Bodies I cannot press against, hair I cannot bury my nose in, vocals I cannot tune to, those who taught me long ago. Love isn't bounded by distance. Without the tech tools of the day, could I honestly say I can conjure sounds, faces, and fill in the rest? Yes, I say, in wonder, tuning to tone and pattern and pacing. Alone, we find the questions, disappointments, confusion, all press, point, direct, suggest. I listen to the heart chambers, music, rhythm, and beat, yearning to dance and laugh, longing for happy feet. An astronaut of the inner cosmos snaps an interior snapshot. I find a pocketed place to land my own rocket and take an inner walk on the dark side. Ground control calls me back to the earth under my feet, to pleasures and wonder of creation and created. And I ask, how much? At what cost? Follow the threads, ride word waves, and never abandon together. For love is a wild creature, teacher. Reach in and out of the silent abyss. Find a lake or a stream or ocean to wash the needs of ourselves or each other. This is why swimming soothes inner streams and quiets a rage, a drought, or a flood. Swim through the rapids and eddies, observe the shore, for rocks and flora until a bank beckons. And it will, I reckon. Thank you.
Thank you, Cher. Up next, we have Jameson Green, who is a renowned transgender activist and author of the award-winning memoir / educational and historical text, Becoming a Visible Man. Jameson will be reading Tailspin.
Thank you, Paige. I used to be a traveler, frequent flyer, globe-trotter, closely monitoring my airline and hotel points. I was constantly aware of flight schedules and routes from various airports I frequented on several continents. I attended meetings and conferences. I flew into cities to speak at corporate offices, medical clinics, government offices, conference centers, and research facilities. Sometimes I even visited friends between appointments. Most often I was in and out quickly. I loved to see people. I enjoyed speaking and contributing my ideas to projects. I took pleasure in sharing a fine meal or coffee or a glass of wine with colleagues from all over the world. I really loved the motion of travel, the logistics, the energy, the acts of arriving and departing, and the sensation of just getting somewhere. In just the last 4 months of 2019, my law and policy advocacy and educational efforts on behalf of transgender people took me to 8 US cities and 2 foreign countries. My work also required 3 trips to Washington, DC. In January 2020, I visited Austin, Texas, and in February, I flew twice to the San Francisco Bay Area. On March 1st, After returning to Portland, the closest airport to my home in Vancouver, Washington, I was relieved there were no trips planned for the next few months. I had writing to do at home on policy papers, and I was developing a book about the history of transgender medicine. For the next few weeks, though, it was difficult to focus on my writing. I kept hearing on the radio about increasing concern over an infectious respiratory disease, which had mysteriously appeared in Washington state. The news kept reporting that people were dying. Doctors didn't know how to treat this COVID thing. There was no cure, only confusion, disbelief, concern, and fear. The medical providers and scientists among my colleagues were on alert. All were watchful, wary, and wanted to respond in helpful ways. The teachers I knew were waiting for instructions. Would schools close? How would the children be kept safe? The national corporations and law firms I worked with, along with the local retail stores and restaurants, seemed to be holding their collective breath. Then the grocery stores started experiencing waves of panic buying. If you weren't fast enough, you might not find toilet paper, flour, canned soup. By March 23rd, 2020, instead of traveling in and out of airport terminals around the world, I was tethered to a different kind of terminal, the one at my desk. The stay-at-home order was issued that day by Governor Inslee and was supposed to last for 2 weeks. The world outside my home stood still. The streets were quiet. It became a mini vacation, a staycation. I have asthma and a healthy fear of suffocation. A deadly respiratory virus was a real threat to me. Air travel did not seem like a healthy option. A trip to Atlanta in May was canceled, along with every other trip planned for that year. I thought staying at home for a while would be just fine. Suddenly, I was negotiating schedules for the same number of engagements, but employing a different kind of travel, ironically called Zoom. Zoom and other video calling technologies such as Skype and WebEx were not new to me. My colleagues and I scattered around the world used all of these programs frequently. I wasn't intimidated. I was going to be fine. I spent those first 2 quiet weeks responding to email requests for Zoom meetings and juggling my schedule to accommodate all the conferences that were being reconfigured on video platforms. My wife Heidi had already been working at home for many years as an instructional designer for a variety of training programs. At first, it was just business as usual, but soon her clients were desperately seeking solutions to training problems they had never before encountered, because almost everyone was working remotely. Hours and hours of existing live classroom training modules had to be quickly redesigned, updated, and converted to online formats. In our working experience, this would be the first time a business slowdown did not result in the elimination of all training budgets. Instead, training via virtual meetings and conferences became the answer to every business problem. In no time, both Heidi and I were busier than ever. 2 weeks after the stay-at-home order was issued, Heidi and I needed a break from our home offices. We decided to take a road trip out to South Bend on the Southwest Washington coast, a small town where my father had been. I had never been there. My father never said much about the place because his parents moved to Los Angeles before he started school. And then the family moved to Portland when he was 12. Heidi and I are both native Californians. I was familiar with much of Oregon because of family visits, and I attended the university there. But neither of us had explored Washington and beyond the Interstate 5 corridor when we visited Heidi's sister in Seattle. We'd moved to Vancouver from the Bay Area just 2 years earlier, and between working and getting settled, we hadn't gotten out much. Heidi and I thought a road trip would be a nice way to spend the day. We'd get some fresh air, have a change of scenery, and I could satisfy a low-level curiosity about my dad's earthly launching point. We packed a couple couple of water bottles, some cheese and crackers and carrot sticks, and I put a fresh cup of coffee in my travel mug. With a full tank of gas, we were off. There was hardly anyone on the city streets or on the freeway. A few cars passed us going in the opposite direction on the state highway, which led to the coast. The day was overcast and gray. We drove by open fields, forests, and farms. We saw nothing commercial or industrial until we reached Longview. Heading west and then north, we followed the Columbia River toward the sea. Among the commercial enterprises, gas stations, roadside stands, and coffee shops we passed, very few appeared to be open for business. We were traveling in what seemed to be abandoned or untouched territory. Humanity was strangely absent, and we felt unsettled and disconnected from the landscape. Watching through our car windows was like watching a still photo projected onto a screen. The only movement was our own. I was reminded of the long distance backpacking I'd done in the High Sierra, where one could go for days without seeing another soul. But this experience was qualitatively different. We were in civilization, in a moving vehicle. Where are all the people one would expect to see? I guess they really meant stay at home, huh? Heidi asked. Yeah, I replied, it's eerie. I mean, I know we're going out through some sparsely populated country, but this is the twilight zone out here. Heidi nodded. It's kind of pretty though. She said, yeah, if you like desolation. Come on, it's not that bad. Heidi always looks for the good in any person or situation. I tend to wait for evidence. I like the rolling hills and the forest, and knowing that the river is just off there, not far away, I said, tipping my head toward the left, where I knew the river flowed. But I worry we really shouldn't be driving around out here. I mean, we're staying in our car, and we're not breathing on anyone, but do you think we could get a ticket or be arrested or something? I never heard anything like that. All they said was stay at home unless you have to go out for some essential reason, Heidi declared. They never said you can't go out at all. As far as I'm concerned, going for a ride in our car is essential to our mental health. Okay, I smiled. I can support that approach. Still, I did not want to encounter any highway patrol officers. Fortunately, we didn't. Unfortunately, we never thought about the lack of restrooms that a social closure of this magnitude would impose. By now, we'd traveled nearly 3 hours and had reached the tiny city of South Bend, Washington. I drove one pass down main drag through town and made a couple of brief excursions through attractive looking side streets. At this point, Heidi and I were keenly aware our legs needed stretching and our bladders needed emptying. I recall seeing an open gas station with a little store about a half-mile back on the main road, so I drove there. I went in to inquire about restrooms, and the lone young man on duty curtly informed me none were available. You know whether anything else in town is open? No. Thanks, I said. Good luck to you. I tried to be sensitive to his situation. Maybe his abruptness stemmed from working in a customer vacuum. He could have been fearful we might expose him to COVID if we came into the store. Good luck to you too, he replied with no emotion or sympathetic look on his face. Nothing, Heidi asked when I got back to the car. Nothing. Welcome to the town where my dad was born 109 years ago. Looks like everything is locked down tight. We decided to drive back through the town slowly in case we missed something the first time. Indeed, there was one public toilet, which turned out to be unlocked and uncleaned. It also lacked a supply of standard paper products. But we made do and decided to return home as quickly as possible. Taking the road, heading east across open farmlands toward the interstate highway, we shaved 25 miles and 30 minutes off our return journey. Back in the warmth and safety of our home, we both wondered if the world would ever be the same. We missed that open, friendly place we had grown up in. Now we found ourselves wistfully remembering, fearful that they never returned. During the following 2 years, despite the ever-changing rules and regulations about public behavior, from vaccination lines to the masking arguments, Heidi and I persisted. We went for walks together in our neighborhood, and we took a few more road trips. We also spent a lot of time on Zoom with friends around the world and with those just a few miles away. From my upstairs home office window, I watched the little children who live on our street and thought about how they are being affected, how their parents have been impacted. I often think about our friends who were school teachers, doctors, and frontline workers. I know they have had to cope with the frustrations of their students and families, their patients, their customers. I also know people who have ridden their Pelotons and hiked their way through the pandemic to stay fit. They have avoided other people's exhalations and escaped the danger of accidental touch. I have stayed in my pod with Heidi and have become a cardboard cutout of myself. I watch myself on my mother. I watch myself listening to other people talking. Watch myself give lectures, make comments, respond to questions, and sometimes even zone out. Often, as I feel my legs cramping, I wish I could go out for a cup of coffee. On some days, my meetings are back to back for hours, and I have no time to even walk across the house to the bathroom. There are other days when I must remain at the keyboard writing. I am all alone. No one is staring at me. Then I am able to move about the house as I want, but I remain ensconced. I spend long hours honing words to inform, educate, and change hearts and minds. It's not the same as traveling, but at least I'm not looking at myself on the screen. I only have to see my hands and look inside my mind and my imagination. These are the best times, along with the other best times, road trips with Heidi. As restrictions are loosening and mask requirements are lessening, people are starting to travel more. Organizations are planning to hold conferences in person again. How can they take that risk? Are they pretending there isn't another viral variant on the horizon? One that could still infect and kill people? Maybe not as many, but still leaving some victims with long COVID symptoms, or worse, dead before their work was finished, leaving their thoughts unexpressed. I feel less desirous of adventure that might expose me to disabling illness or premature death. I appreciate not having to travel to meetings or to deliver public lectures because it saves me time and reduces anxiety about viral contamination to do these activities remotely. Yet there are times when I am writing and the words fly through my fingers and my body feels the motion of the rapid walk through the airport. I hear the rumble of the engines. I feel the pounding of the wheels on the runway, the roar, the lift, the push of the rising elevation. I know I'm going someplace. I know I'll arrive. I want this kinetic force of life again. I want to walk into an auditorium and feel thousands of eyes upon me, not just one eye and a bunch of cardboard cutouts. I want to share space, time, and emotions with people whose lives are as rich and complex as my own. We are beings with feelings and dreams. We need to feel the connections between us. I want that electricity of shared energy, shared emotions, simultaneity, and synchronicity. I'm so blessed to have that on a small scale in my pod with Heidi and over Zoom, through regular connection with our adult children and a few close friends. I need my motion back and the space between meetings, between destinations. Instead of responding to deadlines, rarely moving from my desk, I need the space to think, create, become generative again. I may have asthma, and I may have a healthy fear of suffocation, but there are many ways to suffocate. I am inoculating myself against sedentary restrictions. I am not going to remain tethered to my computer terminal much longer. It has lulled me into a false sense of security, unsafe for the human spirit. I allowed myself to be swept up in the busyness of pandemic panic along with everyone else. We told ourselves because we're busy, everything would be fine. We found new ways to remake our world. But the consequences have not been without peril. I am not in motion in a way that brings me in sync with the rhythm of life. I am not in balance. I must recover from this static clinginess, this tailspin. I am determined to breathe deeply and rise again. I can feel it. Thank you.
Mm.
Thank you, Jameson. Next is Holly Stern, who is a native Oregonian who has made her career as a classical violinist, playing with the Portland Baroque Orchestra, Oregon Bach Festival, Portland Opera, and Oregon Ballet Theater. Grieving During a Pandemic is an adaptation of a chapter from her book, Small Triumphs, Lessons in Alzheimer's and Love, soon to be published.
Thank you, Paige. Grieving during a pandemic. There was plenty of grief to go around in the year 2020. COVID-19 was turning everyone's life upside down, mine included. But I had another reason to grieve: the death of my beloved husband, Don, to Alzheimer's. Not unexpected, but nonetheless devastating. Looking back, I find it hard to distinguish which emotions pertain to my bereavement and which to the global catastrophe. Here in the United States, the mid-March shutdown hit about 5 weeks after my husband died. By that time, I had taken care of most of the paperwork and was trying to keep my life moving forward as best I could. My schedule was packed with a dozen days of disparate music rehearsals and performances. I'm a professional violinist and also sing in my church choir, which is an enjoyable combination until they try to occupy the same time frame. This required traveling, both solo and orchestral violin playing, and choral singing. To add further challenge, one of the choir pieces was about someone who had recently died. I've never figured out how to cry and sing at the same time. There was another question lurking somewhere in the back of my mind, whether packing so much into such a short period was a good idea, especially with the diversity of the commitments and the out-of-town travel, especially with my raw grief. Performing usually feels to me a bit like a high wire act, and Don's death inserted a whole new magnitude of possibilities to fall, to fail. But beginning on the evening of March 11th and over the next few days, everything was canceled. By the 16th, we were totally shut down. Don's celebration of life, which I'd set for the end of April, got moved to September 20th, the 33rd anniversary of our meeting. Then too, that went by the wayside. I was offered a Zoom memorial service, but I remained adamant about waiting until we could gather in person to give him a good send-off. People talk about closure, but I was in no hurry to close this chapter of my life. What the pandemic did give me was time and quiet, space to process my loss. Over the past decade, I promised myself that after Don's death, I would write a book about our Alzheimer's experience. I dove in, putting on paper the thoughts and stories that had been rambling through my brain. The writing gave a fullness to our history and excavated memories of my healthy husband before the disease. By sharing them, I hoped I could help someone else dealing with a loved one's dementia. I still needed to cope with the fact that life without people to bump up against was truly weird. They say you learn by going off course and then correcting. But what if there are no guardrails when you veer too far in one direction? People were my guardrails. And I had to find a way to navigate this thing called grief. Fortunately, my friends were game for walking or bike riding. We masked up, physically distanced, and went out, rain or shine. Sometimes we would get Thai takeout and eat it in my backyard. That area became my living room until it was too cold and damp to be enjoyable. Happily, other friends had covered patios, sometimes even heated and furnished with electric blankets. For a brief while, during good weather, I gave open window concerts on my violin. I texted my neighbors that at 5:15 p.m., I would open my windows and give a short performance. It was my way of offering up an uplifting counterbalance to the pandemic that was slowly eroding our lives. Friends and sometimes passers-by would gather in my driveway, a few with a festive glass of wine in hand, to let the music work its wonders. Unfortunately, it was too soon after Don's death for me to sustain the amount of energy performing requires. Grief regained the upper hand. At one point, it felt like I had crashed into a wall, a blank wall. I decided not to fight it. It may have been gardening season, but I had hit a fallow period. As the pandemic shutdown continued, I freaked out when I realized suddenly that I had not touched another living being in over 2 months. Grieving is one thing, isolation is another. They do not make good companions. It was obviously time to replace our cat, Misty, who had died nearly 2 years earlier. I was not alone in my search for a pet, however. Adoption proved trickier than normal, as the animal shelters were flooded with requests. It seemed I would never make it to the top of the adoption list. A friend recommended I get an adult male cat, as they are often extremely affectionate, but none of the males offered at the time sounded like the right fit. Most were either too old or with medical problems. I was not in a rescuing frame of mind at that point. In desperation, I asked Don if he could help me find a good kitty. You never know what powers the deceased might possess, and I was open to all the help I could get. Sitting down again at my computer, I decided there were 2 somewhat possibilities. So I filled out questionnaires for both. The following day, I got a call from the Humane Society. I had made it to the top of the list. The cat in question did not have a good PR photo. Someone had given him a lion cat with fur on only his head, legs, and the end of his tail. It was a mystery kitty. Little was known about his past. But he was in good health, about a year old, and very affectionate. I signed up for a meet and greet the next day. As I drove him home from the shelter, I introduced him to Beethoven's 7th Symphony on the radio and was pleased to discover my new housemate did not object to classical music. This was an excellent sign. For those of you with inquiring minds, Theo the cat's fur grew out not all at once, but beginning at the nape of his neck and slowly inching its way toward his tail. Meanwhile, on the tail, the fur crept down from the end poof, till the 2 camps met about an inch south of his body. In a shutdown, you have time to notice these things. And I'm happy to report that isolation is so much more manageable when you have a cat purring against you. Then there were the Zoom meetings. God bless ingenuity. Suddenly the world was coming into our homes. This suited the part of me that hates wasted effort. Now I could take classes, listen to concerts, and join groups without having to commute. Learning about racial injustice and spiritual deepening was a fine use of a year when most of my music making, aside from a virtual choir, was put on hold. In a way, I was growing myself out of my grief, and I could feel Dawn cheering me on. After more than 2 years and many delays, we held a celebration of life for Dawn. It fell on May Day, which coincided with World Laughter Day, a perfect combination for my husband. The long hiatus proved a blessing. I was finally able to turn from grieving to embracing the celebration he deserved. I wonder how I might have fared without the shutdown. That time was immeasurably rich for me. I now have many new friends, a more profound appreciation of the importance of connectedness, and a realization of what I need for a good mental outlook. Had life proceeded at its normal pace, I might have spent much more time and effort in just trying to keep up, nibbling away at my grief in between other activities. I don't want in any way to minimize the heartbreak and devastation COVID-19 has wreaked on the world. This is not an attempt to glory in the shutdown. I was simply fortunate that the time and space it afforded me was exactly what I needed to deal with my own private grief. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. Our next performer is Weston Anderson, who is a writer and storyteller living in Portland, Oregon. They daylight as a science writer in the biomedical research field. Weston spent much of the first 2 years of the COVID pandemic producing Queer Meets Queer, a podcast dedicated to telling true LGBTQ+ relationship stories. They will be performing their piece, Not My Package.
Package arrived one day addressed to a previous occupant of our house. We got a lot of their junk mail, but this was the only package. It was plain brown, sort of medium-sized, lightweight. We didn't know what to do with it. We put a sticky note on it. They don't live here, and left it by the door. But the mail carrier wouldn't take it. It sat on our porch for a long time before I brought it in. None of us were willing to take it to the post office. The post office wasn't far away, but we didn't dare go. This was spring 2020, the start of a pandemic. We didn't go anywhere if it wasn't strictly necessary. Dealing with this package didn't seem necessary. It wasn't worth dying for. I felt put upon. The early weeks and months of the pandemic were exhausting and deeply disorienting. I didn't have the capacity to resolve this package thing. It wasn't my fault it got delivered. I had my mail forwarded. Why couldn't they? It's not that hard. I didn't care if this guy got his package or not. I didn't want to expend any effort on this stupid package. I must not have been alone. My 3 roommates never did anything with the package either. So it sat in our house, floating from the kitchen counter to the kitchen table, and finally to a more or less permanent spot by the door. It was out of the way there, mostly. The early days of the pandemic were strange. Within 48 hours, me and my 3 roommates all either lost our jobs or were switched to permanent work from home. We went from spending time mostly out of the house to spending time only inside the house. We went from hardly ever seeing each other to seeing no one else, going nowhere else. We had nothing to do. We weren't trapped, but we were confined. I started to keep a daily journal. Day 48 of social isolation. Nothing happens. No one comes, no one goes. It's awful. I was single. My isolation pod consisted of my roommates, which included my best friend, Seth. My roommates and I spent too much time together. We ran out of things to say. It was lonely. I got tired of seeing that package every time I passed by the door. It was a thing out of place, out of time. It didn't belong. I proposed we open it. I wondered what it could be without actually caring. Opening it just seemed like a way to move forward, to resolve. Seth was absolutely opposed. Opening the package was a crime. It was an invasion of privacy. It was unethical. Seth was right, of course, but I didn't feel particularly persuaded by his arguments. Seth was and is always challenging me to be better, more conscientious, to tread more lightly. I appreciate a challenge. I also loathe a challenge, but I love, admire, and respect Seth. So I tried to accept his challenges. I agreed not to open the package. Day 49 of social isolation. Had a vivid dream last night. A boy and I were in bed together. He was around my age. He looked like someone I knew, but wasn't. In the dream, he was light, easily maneuverable. He did what I wanted him to do instinctively. In short, he was a fantasy. I had this strange sort of exhilarated relief, like finally, the boy and I have kissed. We are making out and we've agreed to take things slow. It was so loving and sensual. It felt so good to be held like that, to feel loved like that, to be present like that. It was almost a shame to wake up. But something was wrong. The door to the bedroom kept slipping open. We were making out and trying to be present together, and the door would open, and I would sense this presence in the hallway. Someone was out there. When I finally got up to investigate, I discovered that the house was filled with people in theatrical dress and staging. I shouted at them to get out of my house, but they just eyed me warily. I tried all kinds of ways to elicit a response from them. I sprayed them with a hose. I beat them with pillows. I shouted until I was hoarse. None of it made any difference. They didn't budge an inch. I couldn't annoy them. I couldn't intimidate them. I felt afraid of them. Their presence unsettled me. If they wanted to, they could overwhelm me, they could hurt me. But they just watched and looked a little bored and inconvenienced at being made wet. Then I woke up. I'm a compulsive reader. I've gotten into the habit of reading the news on my phone most mornings, a sure sign that I've become an adult. In the months after the March 2020 lockdowns, there were two stories you could pretty much count on every day. Updated pandemic metrics, how many people tested positive and how many people died, and the national toilet paper shortage. I kept track of both every morning, first while drinking coffee and then while sitting on the toilet. The COVID metric stories were abstract. Graphs of exponential growth, reader-friendly explanations of deeply complicated statistical modeling, and ever-growing figures of the dead and the sick. The toilet paper stories felt more real somehow. The news ran stories of runs on toilet paper at grocery stores alongside photographs of forlorn shoppers standing in empty paper goods aisles. Just what am I going to do? The shoppers seem to stay slump-shouldered, staring at their shelves. I walked those empty aisles myself, but I never walked the hospital hallways filled with the COVID sick. Thank goodness I haven't gotten sick yet, I think. And thank goodness for my bidet. By accident, I escaped becoming part of either of these stories. I worked from home and was able to self-isolate. My roommates and I stayed healthy in those early months, so we didn't become part of the statistics reported in the news. Also, shortly before the pandemic, Seth and I had invested in a bidet and a set of washable microfiber towels, butt towels, we call them. So we largely avoided the toilet paper shortage. Day 118 of social isolation. July. More than halfway through 2020. Cue existential dread. Cue guilt for having wasted another summer of my youth. Cue emotional exhaustion. Cue depression. Cue resentment. Okay, take a sip of coffee, eat a bite of donut. For long periods of time, I mostly forgot about the box. Most of the time, I didn't notice it, but I still had to nudge it out of its corner by the door to sweep up the dust piles, more like dust dunes that built up around it. It went on like this for months. I mostly forget the box until it unexpectedly came into view. When I noticed it, I would go through the entire gamut of emotions I went through when it first arrived. Annoyance that it was delivered at all. Exasperation at the thought of taking it to the post office. Curiosity about what it might contain. Shame for feeling curious, for wanting to open someone else's mail. Resignation, acceptance, forgetfulness. Then I'd stub my toe on it, and it all started up again. Day oh, how I resented the box. We were in a stalemate. I had promised Seth I wouldn't open it. Throwing it away felt wrong. Taking it to the post office, impossible. There was no way to move forward. The box had become a part of the house. It blended in with the new workstation in the living room, with the flowers I bought when I felt sorry for myself, with the stack of comic books my roommates read, with the pile of shoes by the front door. One day, I looked up and discovered that Seth, my best friend, my creative partner, my housemate, was in the middle of excitedly telling me his plans to move to Vancouver, British Columbia. He wanted to go back to school. I helped him with his application essay. One day I looked up again and Seth had been accepted into an undergraduate program. Seth was moving out, moving on, moving up. I eyed the box in its corner. It hadn't moved more than 6 inches in 6 months. Day 268 of social isolation. Time is going by so quickly, and soon Seth will be gone. I feel like we should do something, many things, while we still can, while it's still so easy. Fast as rounding the corner, Seth moved out. Another roommate moved in. I celebrated the gift of living with a friend and grieved that friend's departure. I forgot about the box. Day 299 of social isolation. Things I miss about Seth. Hearing him laugh, sing, whistle. All the different ways his hair piles on his head. Running errands together, grabbing food together, high fives. Riding in his car. The little presents we exchanged, his knock on my door, hugs. Not long after Seth moved out, the box suddenly burst into my consciousness. There it was, in its place by the door, as always, right at the edge of my peripheral vision. Once again, I reminded myself that I had promised Seth I would not open the box. But Seth doesn't live here anymore. I heard my inner voice tell me, that's right. He doesn't live here anymore. So he doesn't get a say in this anymore. I grabbed the box and fast walked it to the kitchen table. I'm opening the box, I announced to my roommate who was sitting at his desk in the living room. Okay. He said, Seth doesn't live here anymore. He said as if that clearly justified the crime he was about to commit. I grabbed a butter knife and I sliced through the brown packing tape that sealed the top of the box. I didn't bother cutting the sides. I slipped my fingers insides and pried the flaps open with a horrific ripping sound. I reached in and pulled out a handful of packing paper and tossed it aside. I had long suspected that the box might contain a computer component or something, a mouse, a charging cable, something of that nature. I didn't expect that it would be anything of value. What I relished in that moment was putting the box behind me once and for all, and achieving a final resolution to its errant delivery. When I saw what was inside, I chuckled. I half screamed at what I saw. I tossed my head back and laughed. My roommate looked at me strangely. What is it? He asked. As an answer, I reached inside and pulled out what it contained. 2 rolls of toilet paper.
Thank you, storytellers. Thank you, Weston, for wrapping that up. We will take a brief intermission. We will reset the room, and then we will have all the storytellers at the front for a brief Q&A. Okay, and welcome back. Thank you, storytellers, for all being here, for sharing your words. We are going to now take some questions from the audience. So, first of all, can you tell us, how did this COVIDOLOGY collection begin? How did it become a collection? And how did each of you individually craft and cultivate your stories?
Okay, so. The idea came to me from the Zoom groups that I was facilitating, and I was really privileged to hear so many stories. People were very kind to dig deep and be vulnerable and talk about their experiences, and oftentimes be able to talk about their experiences with COVID in a way that they didn't feel comfortable sharing to their loved ones, you know. I think in some ways there was some anonymity initially, meeting new people and to feel comfortable. So that's kind of what sparked it for me. And I reached out to a number of people, and we have a subset of those people here today.
Well, I was one of the people on one of Paul's Zooms, and he, I don't know, maybe a few weeks before the deadline announced that he was putting together this anthology, and I thought, I'm too involved with other things. I don't need another thing on my plate. And then he mentioned it again the day before the deadline, and it's about the pandemic and how we've dealt with it. And I thought, I've written this chapter in my book that grieving during the pandemic, maybe I can repurpose it. And so I presented it to Paul, and he agreed to take it. And the whole process was just so amazing because he had other editors with their eyes on it, and other readers and people that could point out where something wasn't clear because they didn't know me, and so they weren't in my head already. And it was just a wonderful process. And even the day before the final edit, Paul we had scheduled an hour, and we ended up spending an hour and a half and say, read this paragraph to me, and then we rearranged things. And it was actually the night before that I had an epiphany that I could actually put those changes from Google Docs right into the document. I didn't have to sidebar and then go, why is it covering up? Epiphanies are great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Holly.
I love epiphany, and I'm gonna add serendipity to that, I think, because it seemed like a serendipitous event in which I met Paul for the first time. This was just as he was gathering the ideas for the COVIDOLOgy, and extended the invitation to me, and I just found it to be such a creative spark. So I was drawn to do it. Then, as things go, often not necessarily the way you think they're going to, I thought I was writing a prose piece, but honestly, I would say that prose piece had taken on a life of its own. I'm not sure where it was going. But I also, at the same time, throughout this several years, have been writing with poets several times a week, and realized I had a poem about my COVID experience. So I felt so grateful that I had something to contribute to this, because it's been an incredible experience.
Thank you, Cher.
Yeah, about this time last year, Paul did a storytelling event about COVID, just COVID stories. And I was actually part of that storytelling event. And it was when Paul reached out to say, hey, I've got this anthology I'm thinking about with essays about our experience with COVID. I'd kind of thought, wait, I could kind of take that short story that I told there and just kind of expand it and kind of hit it a lot deeper than I could probably in a 5-minute story or storytelling. So yeah, it kind of, I was so excited to be a part of this, and I really second about the editors and the readers. That was such an amazing process. You put something down on paper and you think, oh, I feel okay about this. And then they just kind of take it to just such a higher level. It's just such a wonderful experience.
Thank you, Stacy.
Sure.
Paul and I had done some storytelling together in the past. Paul's been something of a mentor to me since 2019, and helped me work on the podcast and get some funding for that. And so when Paul reached out with this question to write a COVID story, it was so nice to have a prompt. I think one of the things that's really hard about writing is getting started, and responding to something makes it a lot easier. But I also just didn't know what to write. I thought about it for months, and I had lots of conversations with a lot of people in my life about, you know, how do I write a story about the most boring, uneventful. I barely want to think about it. And so how do I bring this into something cool? And I ended up thinking about this box one day and telling it as a story to my partner Bobby. And at the end of it, I was like, this is it. This is the story that I have to tell for this piece.
Thank you, Weston.
Yeah, I had worked with Paul at a storytelling event back in 2018, I think it was. And so then when he was looking for contributing authors for this anthology, he put me in an email and call for contributors. And I thought, at the time I was working on a really intense academic history project that actually has taken years. It was almost done. But I thought, well, this is interesting. I could use a break. This is good because he's got a time limit. He's got a word count limit. It's short. I don't have to cite anything. And I know how fun it is to work with Paul on the storytelling projects. So I thought, why not, exercise the more creative muscle for a change instead of the sluggy academic muscle. And so here we are. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that stories are one of the best ways to connect people, but it's not easy to tell your story. So what was the easiest part of telling your story, and what was the hardest part?
Okay, I'll jump in. And still the easiest part is this interpersonal sharing of stories, however it came about, from the invitation to the structure that Paul set up so that we had feedback, so that there was this ongoing process that involved other people. That was the place that felt most natural, and also the place that probably many of us missed very much. I certainly did. And then the hardest, I don't know if this is hard, it kind of is, but to start out thinking I was going one place and ending up someplace else. But I also am a consummate believer in a process, and that if you trust the process, you will get to where you need to go. And it doesn't really matter how many bumps there are. Well, it does kind of, but you don't want too many bumps, but bumps are part of it.
Well, the easy part for me was that it had already been written in a way. The hardest part was Google Docs. And I realized that I was getting a bit cranky because there would be, somebody wouldn't get it. Why can't they get it? And it was just because I was having trouble communicating with them on the sidebar. So it was, I just found it really rewarding to have access to so many eyes and ears and experiences, and then doing this has been just a wonderful door opening. I love telling stories, and this has been really fun.
Yeah, the easiest part, I think that I found was just and I guess you could say this is a part, but it was the support that I actually got as I was working through my essay and trying to figure out where I was going. And Paul was there, just providing a lovely, safe, wonderful space to kind of think about some of these things and to you know, and so that was just lovely to have that. It made it so much easier to actually do this. The hardest part for me was just the dragging up of things that you think you've settled decades ago. But then they come back up. Things is just like going back home for my father's funeral. And the fact is, there were so many people that had never seen Stacy, and even in my previous life. And so kind of thinking back through that again, it's always a situation that's deeply fraught with all kinds of issues. What I can say though is that it's always expect the worst, and it never is. It's always great. So yes, I'm kind of working back through all that.
For me, the easiest part was saying, yes, I'll do this. And then the hardest part was actually getting started with the writing. And as Weston says, it was a very boring kind of a period. And as I had mentioned in my story, that I felt like a cardboard cutout and everything was so flat. And how do you make that come alive? And then I came up with the notion of motion, that whole, and I just wanted to create that feeling and talk about that process and the impact of the situation that we were all in through that metaphor, so to speak. And once I got that went well, but that was hard to come to. It really took me quite a while after accepting the assignment. Okay, that was. But once I did, yes.
I think for me, I had gone through the same process as everyone else did, because I wrote a story also, and I was able to sort of lean into getting that coaching and feedback, which was super helpful. And I was also at that period of time, I had a different story when I pitched it, but I was really into this ancestry thing. So that was just like, I was so into the whole ancestry thing that the first feedback I got from the coach was like, that's a great story, but what does it have to do with, COVID-19? Like, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. COVID. Have it all fit again. Like, that's right. I had COVID. Just trying to find a way. Like, oh yeah. But also something I didn't realize when I first started this, because it's like you just learn as you go. But we had beta testers, readers that I didn't think of when I first started this. So we sent this out to very diverse people all over the United States, and we got feedback back. And it's like, oh, like I thought we were done with feedback, but we got a little bit more. And so it was all on us to say, okay, this is what a potential reader thinks about your story. And so that was also super helpful. So I think that just worked well. But I also honestly have to say, being here in Bend today, and we were here yesterday, it's been very easy for us to get together and communicate. I'm just so grateful for District's Library for this opportunity. And we don't really know each other super well. And most of us didn't know each other prior to this. So just like, oh, like, this is kind of cool. Like, just to be able to hear each other's stories and to be asked these questions. We didn't know the answer, like we didn't get to hear other people's answers prior to this. So I'm just really grateful for that. I think the most challenging is when you publish, not having published before, there's so many questions that are, do you want to have an ebook? Do you want to have an audiobook? And then this, and then, just the whole thing around publishing is just overwhelming to me, but we made it. So we're here. So.
I think the hardest part for me was finding a story I wanted to tell. There were a lot of stories I knew that I did not want to tell about COVID. It was a very, very long time for everyone. It was. And so, there's a lot of stories I could tell about the house politics I had with my roommates, which I felt completely unprepared to even delve into, because for people confined in the house together who none of us had anyone in our pot outside the house. And so it was just before us for a really, really long time. And we weren't necessarily the best of friends, and there were times where it was downright uncomfortable being there. And I knew that that just was stuff that was too personal, not just for me, but for my roommates. Like getting into that was just not going to work. And so once I found a story that I felt like I could tell, that I had the authority to tell, that wasn't going to be taking the story from my roommates or something, if that makes sense, putting words in my mouth in a way that I didn't want to do. Writing it was pretty easy. And then another hard thing was, today was easier, but yesterday we did another event. I got kind of emotional talking about my friend Seth moving away, and I wasn't expecting that I was going to like feel those feelings and moving in, but it definitely brought stuff up that I kind of thought I was kind of
Yes, thank you all for sharing such vulnerability with us. This is really impactful because we're not only hearing your words, but we're hearing your feelings too. And all of you brought that with you today. So thank you for that. As a final question, unless we have any from the audience. Yeah, Heidi, go ahead.
So I really enjoyed the presentation and all of you sharing in your emotions living on your faces. That was really powerful. And most of you talked about really missing people and the not just, oh, I miss my friend, but more of the deep longing that seemed to build as you were there in this, sort of confined world, longer and longer and longer. And I'm curious, for each of you taking a step outside of the house, wherever you were confined, the first or second time, what was that like being with people again? How did it feel? How was it different than how you'd been before the pandemic even started? I'm just curious, that experience, were you aware of it, or was it just back to business as usual?
Oh, I can probably start on that. I found it incredibly interesting because I'm an extrovert and I need to be around people. And of course, that added a whole other layer to being socially isolated. But I found that when I finally got back out among people, it's almost like I had to go back to extrovert 101. I just didn't know how to interact with people or how to. I was just saying some crazy things. Well, not my house anymore. I do, But I was so. It still interests me how that kind of a muscle that you just think is a natural part of yourself actually had to be exercised again. And
Yeah, I really relate to that also. I'm very introverted. And so we're social creatures and people. It's true for everybody. But sure, thank you. But there were definitely things I didn't miss about being social that the pandemic allowed me to not have to even think about anymore. And in a lot of ways, I haven't gone back to the way things used to be. There's whole groups of friends that before the pandemic, I used to spend a lot of time with, and then a year and a half later, after not really being in contact, those relationships are different. It's just not the same as it used to be. And so my social world in Portland is very, very different now than it was before the pandemic. And I'm not doing things that I used to do before the pandemic. I'm not really going to parties. I still see close friends, usually in small groups, but I've kind of given myself permission to be an introvert in a way that I didn't as much before. But my social skills are, I had practiced a lot and being in groups and meeting people, and
I am bad at it again. Very.
Well, I had already gone through that layer of structuring my life to include other people, because the last 20 months of Don's life, he was in a foster care home. And I knew that I had to put structure in my life so that I wouldn't just totally withdraw. And in the process, I gained a lot of new friends, and I realized I had to see people every day. And so fortunately, we could do it outside. And so, you know, we would walk in the rain. We might be walking down the street because the cars weren't there and masked or whatever the thing was at the time. But we did it. And the conversations were deeper than they were more interesting. They were more into how are you really doing? How are you really dealing with this? And so that was, I think, really a good thing. And then when things opened up, I think the most amazing thing for those of us who were performers was to actually be able to be there in person and give concerts still masked, which is another thing because, you know, your glasses steam up and your eyeballs disappear into the mask and all of that sort of thing, but still being able to have a physical audience out there. And then from the audience side, to be able to go to the symphony and everybody's masked and everybody's had their vaccination stuff checked and everything, but to be there in person and to realize how very important that was to non-performers, because I mean, it was just so visceral. They were so happy to be there for a live performance. And then the other thing that amazed me was how quickly you go back into old habits like, hi, how's it
Everything that everyone has said. I think I have a greater sense of gratitude for everyone that I care about. Also have less patience for the trivial. And I imagine that could carry on from here on out. So it's very interesting to watch oneself. And Holly, when you mentioned the part in your story where you hadn't touched another person for a period of time, I think I was 4 to 5 months in and went to see, very cautiously went to see a friend. She grabbed me and hugged me. Oh my gosh. I didn't even worry. No, we had all been so careful that, you know, you would stand far apart from people, and we had, you know, we all had our own ways of trying to respect the other person, trying to respect ourselves and our safety. So those are some things, and it'll be very interesting to see what carries forward. I think I value life.
Yeah, you value life more and you still want to protect it too at the same time. And now we know to be respectful of another person, you have to protect them, you know, and at least that's how I feel. To me, it's been really great to get back into actual community with other people. And I've been to 3 conferences, one with 1,200 people. And you know, it's just so great to see people know that you don't see except at conferences around the world. You know, for me, that's my experience. That it, you know, and just to see them again and to be able to shake their hand or hug them But everybody asks, how are you about hugging? Are you okay? All right. And it's refreshing and reinvigorating. And also, gives there is pause because of this, what we've all been through, that there's still risk out there. And yet, you have to have people. People need people. Yes, yeah, I mean, seriously, though, it's true. That song was ahead of its time.
Yeah, this just resonates so much with me. Like Stacy was talking about being an expert. I'm an expert too, but I have to admit, I surprised myself that we had built a deck on the back of our house, like in 2019, not knowing COVID was coming. So my backyard was like my office, my outside office, surrounded by flowers and trees. So I had Zoom, so I had people in my life, and I kind of liked it. And my husband working from home, we had more time together. Our dog loved it because it was like we just had better connections. And so I was not in any hurry to go back to the way it was before. And then people say, "Oh, you want to meet up for coffee?" I don't know, it's too much work, and and then
Well, thanks, Paul.
but there was a time where I pushed for the senior center that they would write a grant because the people who are left behind in technology, I felt like weren't getting a fair shake.
Yeah.
What about all the old people who get? So anyway, they wrote a grant and they got approved funding, and they're like, okay, they wrote me into the grant, like make it happen. And I'm like, oh, like, oh my God, this is when you kind of be 6 feet apart and everything. So what we did is that we illegally went to the closed senior center. You can imagine it was a small number of seniors. This was like against the law, I want you to know. But we took a risk. People masked up and everything, but we had people with technology there, and we had them paired up with AmeriCorps Vista people. And it was like, oh my goodness, it was like so incredible to watch this happen. And a lot of times it's the first time I'd be like, where's the keyboard? Like, you don't need a keyboard. You don't. So people were able to just benefit from technology, and several of them are now doing conversations with their doctors. So that was just so gratifying. But the day that I was going there to do this, here I was being really selfish. I put pants. You know what I mean? Like I had to get dressed. I had to drive. I had to find parking.
Yeah.
But there was an 81-year-old gentleman who took all day to really get there and go home. He had to take the shuttle to come there. He's had a lot of chronic conditions, and just seeing him smile and to be able to connect on our virtual call, it's like he can now do this from home. And I'm like, wow, I'll put pants on now. Like I'll get over myself. But there was a period of time where I didn't want things to go back. But as a performer, I didn't realize how I missed it. I was doing a Mortified Nation thing at Alberta Rose Theater, and everyone was like so spot on, 1 seat apart. Everyone has to get their thing verified, and the audience just needed to laugh. I think there was just like this period where we just missed laughing, and it was really kind of funny content. And I see that now. I'm presenting at conference again, and I use that term motion. I'm like, I'm gonna be back in motion again. So I'm getting my extrovert thing back now. But there was a period of time I'm like, I'm good. I'm good. So
Great. Well, what a perfect way to end. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here in person. This is so great to get to have you here in the room with us. And thank you to everyone who's in the virtual audience who is able to attend through the accessibility of technology. I can't tell you how much it meant to hear your stories and your wisdom and your vulnerability and your love. So thank you so much for bringing that to the table. This has been a production of Deschutes Public Library with our COVIDOLOGY storytelling. So we hope that we will see you again very soon. Check out DeschutesLibrary.org for all of our other great, fun, free programs. And we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye.